This is a free audiobook recording of Pride and Prejudice in the public domain, brought to you by the audiobook Novelist.
Chapter 10. The day passed, much as the day before had done. Jane was still very poorly, and Elizabeth would not quit her until late in the evening. When it did not rain, the gentlemen walked. Miss Bingley was very attentive to Darcy, and more than once tried to engage him in conversation about books, tastes, and accomplishments, always with the intent of displaying her own refinement. Darcy, however, was often reserved in his replies. His thoughts were not wholly on Miss Bingley, and it was becoming clearer to Elizabeth that she amused and even puzzled him in the evening. The ladies assembled in the drawing room. Miss Bingley, seated next to Darcy, began once again to discuss what qualities made an accomplished woman. A woman must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, and the modern languages, said she. She must also possess a certain something in her air and manner of walking, added her sister, Mrs. Hurst. Darcy replied, to all this she must yet add something more substantial in the improvement of her mind by extensive reading. Elizabeth could not help smiling. I am no longer surprised at your knowing only 6 accomplished women. I rather wonder now at your knowing any. Darcy looked at her with real admiration, though his manner was as composed as ever. As the evening continued, Miss Bingley grew more uneasy. She was not blind to Darcy's interest in Elizabeth, and it stung her pride. She tried to mock Elizabeth in subtle ways, especially when Elizabeth was reading. How fond Miss Eliza is of reading, she remarked with a sly smile. She must walk the entire library by now. Elizabeth ignored the remark, choosing not to feed Miss Bingley's malice. She continued reading with an air of calm superiority. Soon after, Darcy took up a book himself, while Bingley played the piano and spoke cheerfully to Jane. The whole scene struck Elizabeth as odd, a mixture of true affection and polite formality, jealousy and interest, pride and kindness. As the evening wore on, Darcy began pacing the room, deep in thought. I wonder at you, Darcy, said Miss Bingley. To walk about the room in this way is a luxury which only you could indulge in. I dare say you do it only because you know it makes you look interesting. You either choose this method of showing off, she continued, or you have a dislike for the common sitting posture. Darcy turned to her and said with a touch of humor, I do it because I enjoy thinking. I have not the honor of pleasing myself by appearing charming, as you suppose. Miss Bingley, though disappointed by his indifference, would not give up. Miss Eliza, let me persuade you to join Mr. Darcy in his walk. I assure you, it would be most agreeable. Elizabeth declined politely. You had much better go, Miss Bingley said again. I always enjoy seeing you two together. Such contrast. But Darcy said nothing, and Elizabeth soon turned her attention back to her book. Miss Bingley, seeing that her attempts at mischief were failing, took up some needlework and sat in sullen silence. Thus ended another day at Netherfield, with emotions growing deeper, jealousies sharper, and the connection between Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy becoming increasingly complex even if unspoken. Chapter 11. When the ladies removed after dinner, Elizabeth ran up to her sister, and seeing her well guarded from cold, attended her into the drawing room, where she was welcomed by her friends with many professions of pleasure. Elizabeth had never been more at a loss to make her feelings appear what they ought to be. Mr. Darcy's behavior astonished and vexed her. He had never spoken to her at all on the previous evening, and now, though he appeared to seek her company, he spoke little and seemed wrapped in thought. She could not understand him. Miss Bingley, meanwhile, was doing her utmost to draw Darcy's attention, talking about books, balls, and fashionable society, all in the hope of being admired. But Darcy was mostly silent. He occasionally replied to her with civility, but showed no encouragement beyond what politeness required. When Elizabeth was engaged in conversation with Bingley and Jane, Darcy drew nearer, listening without joining in. Elizabeth, aware of his gaze, determined not to be disturbed by it, and continued her cheerful remarks. Miss Bingley grew irritated. Miss Eliza Bennet, she said, really deserves to be called a wit. I am afraid Mr. Darcy will soon be charmed. Again, Darcy looked at Elizabeth and said, Miss Bennet has a lively manner which greatly recommends her to me. Elizabeth blushed and laughed, uncertain whether it was meant as irony or admiration. Miss Bingley, shocked, immediately shifted the conversation. Later in the evening, when Elizabeth rose to take a turn around the room with Miss Bingley, Darcy stood up to join them. You do not want me to walk with you, he said. You either think me tiresome or wish to enjoy your own conversation without my intrusion. We do not want your company at all, sir, Miss Bingley replied. You may stay where you are. You certainly choose to be frank, said he, smiling. You are determined to be teased, said Elizabeth. You could not really believe that you are welcome to walk with us. I have particular pleasure in the society of intelligent women, said Darcy. Elizabeth said no more, but her thoughts were active. Darcy's words confused her. She did not believe he admired her, and yet he often looked at her, listened to her, and even sought her company. What could it mean? Miss Bingley, meanwhile, was left to simmer in silent resentment. She had begun to see that Darcy's attention was slipping away from her, and she could not tolerate it. As the evening came to a close, Elizabeth could only reflect on the strange mixture of behavior she had observed: kindness from Bingley, awkward civility from Darcy, cold condescension from Miss Bingley, and the growing suspicion that something in the household was shifting. Chapter 12. In consequence of an agreement between the sisters, Elizabeth wrote the next morning to her mother to beg that the carriage might be sent for them in the course of the day. But Mrs. Bennet, who had calculated on her daughters remaining at Netherfield till the following Tuesday, was quite disappointed. She wrote back a somewhat theatrical note, insisting that if Jane were not quite recovered, she should certainly not think of leaving the house. Elizabeth, though convinced that her sister was well enough to return home, respected her mother's wishes and agreed to stay. However, by the evening of that same day, the situation had changed. Jane herself expressed a desire to return home, and Elizabeth was eager to be away from the attentions of Miss Bingley and the confusion of Mr. Darcy's manner. Mr. Bingley, though clearly disappointed, arranged for the carriage to be sent early the next morning, as the sisters departed. Mr. Bingley handed Jane into the carriage with warm civility, and Elizabeth noticed the genuine regret in his eyes. Miss Bingley said little and offered few parting compliments. Mr. Darcy simply bowed as they drove away. Elizabeth reflected on her short stay at Netherfield. While it had deepened her confidence in Bingley's affection for Jane, it had also increased her dislike for the Bingley sisters and, further, complicated her thoughts about Mr. Darcy. His pride, his reserve, his strange interest in her all remained a puzzle. Jane, meanwhile, said little. She seemed thoughtful and hopeful, and Elizabeth could tell that her feelings for Bingley were growing more sincere. I do hope Mama will not press the subject too eagerly when we return, Elizabeth said aloud. Bingley likes you, I know, but too much fuss may frighten him off. I shall say nothing to encourage or discourage, Jane replied with a smile. If he likes me, he will come. As the Bennet sisters approached Longbourn, their minds were full of expectations, questions, and unspoken hopes, and, though the visit to Netherfield was over, its consequences had only just begun.